We do know that she submitted Wife to James Whelan to the Abbey, and it was rejected. And there's a letter, which is probably dealing with this play, from about 1942, where she says this. Bligh's letter, when returning the play, showed clearly that he has no use for my work. Never asked to see any more. It may be a good thing to be finished with the Abbey, yet I love the Abbey, and their actors are fine. From that point onward, the Abbey only ever produced one more of her plays. In 1948, there was an experimental play called Light Falling, produced in the Abbey's second stage, the Peacock Theatre. From that point onward, she wrote mostly for radio. Now, this in itself is remarkable, and this is something else I want to just tease out a little bit. Because around 1913-1914, she contracted Meniere's disease, which caused her to go deaf. So she was in university. She would be one of the first generation of women to attend university in Ireland. Went to University College Dublin, and she contracted Meniere's disease and became deaf. So she was deaf from about 1914 onwards. So through the whole period that she's writing plays, including the play you saw this evening, she was deaf. Her plays start to be produced for radio at the peak of her success in 1936. Now, the first radio broadcast here in the States was 1922, I think. The first one in Ireland was 1926. So it would have been about approximately 12 years after she went deaf that radio starts. And yet she starts writing for radio, which I find remarkable. From the time the Abbey start rejecting her work onwards, that is primarily how she makes her living as a writer, and it's primarily the form for which she writes. And the remarkable thing is that she is a very good writer for radio. It sounds like an ironic thing to say, but she has a great ear. That she has a great sense of what you need to be told. And she adapted her stage plays for radio, and the ways in which she writes in, say, for instance, voiceover narration to tell you just what you need to know, the way she uses sound effects, like the one I started out with this afternoon here, the door slamming, the way she uses silence. She has an incredible sense of how the plays work, almost as music. So, I think this is part of the mix when we start to try to understand the kinds of things that we saw on the stage here this afternoon. But let's go back also to the idea that she's a woman living in this period, of the 1930s and 1940s, and writing then. One of the plays that really, I think, made her reputation was the first one to be performed on radio and the first one to be televised. It was a short play called The King of Spain's Daughter. Now, the Mint are going to do a reading of it here on September 19th. And for me, The King of Spain's Daughter is a good way to get a grasp of what she's doing with her female characters. And I think particularly the more complex ones that she develops later, like Nan Bowers, who you would have seen in this play. The King of Spain's Daughter is set on a stage, simple stage, one-act play, where you have a road. And at the back of the road, there's a great big sign that says "Road Closed." And you have this character named Annie Kinsella. And Annie has a choice between marrying a man, Jim Harris, who she clearly has no affection for, or going to work in a factory. And they're not great options. And throughout the play, you never really know what it is that this character wants to do. At points, she seems to not remember what she's done the previous night. She seems not to remember things she said to Jim. She'll say things to him that would make you think that she has some affection for him, and then she'll suddenly turn around and just turn her back on him. She's a character who doesn't seem to engage in a funny way with the other characters around her. Now, I think you can see where Nan Bowers might be coming from here. But here's what happens at the end of The King of Spain's Daughter. At the end of the play, Annie Kinsella decides to marry this man, Jim Harris, after she sees his fairly meager bank book. And here's what she says at the curtain line. "He put by 2 shillings for 200 weeks. I think he's a man that, supposing he was jealous, might cut your throat." And the stage directions say she's exultant as she says this. Now, in a letter to her friend Florence Hackett, Teresa Deevy says this. She says the play is a comedy. Annie marries Jim quite reconciled at last, as she has found passion in his persistent affection, and so can visualize herself as the heroine of a possible tragedy. And later, when the play was produced for radio, she said more or less the same thing. She wrote to the radio producer and said, well, it's a comedy. Being a romantic, Annie likes to picture herself in danger. At one point in that play, King of Spain's Daughter, one character says to Annie Harris, "Oh, but you're a wild creature." And that's where I took the title for this afternoon's talk, "Oh, but you're a wild creature." There's this sense that with some of Teresa Deevy's characters, and particularly some of the female characters, there is something about the character that simply cannot be governed, that there is a power of imagination, that there is an inner core that these characters preserve regardless of the circumstances around them and regardless of the fact that, as the sign at the end of King of Spain's Daughter says, the road is closed. Yeah. You see this in what's probably her best-known work, a play called Katie Roche. It was first staged in 1936 in the Abbey. It was actually revived in 1994. Katie Roche again deals with a character like Nan Bowers in some ways, who is in a situation where she has two choices, neither of which she seems to want to take. She has a choice between two men. One's a younger man, full of life, full of enthusiasm, quite immature, and not very good prospects. The other's an older man, Stanislaus, who is established, older, but doesn't seem to have much passion for her and is not very attractive as a character. She chooses Stanislaus, and she chooses to go to marry him and eventually to leave the town where she grew up with him. And here's what she says at the curtain. Now, you would think that this is a defeat for her, to marry this man she clearly doesn't love. But here's what she says, and again, interestingly, Teresa Deevy's stage direction says she is exultant. This is her key word, I think, in her stage directions. She says, "I will be brave. I was looking for something great to do. Sure, now I have it." Choosing this difficult thing, choosing the most difficult thing for her to do, marry the man she doesn't love, live her life with him, is for her heroic. It's brave. It's the thing she can choose to do, and she can imagine that as a kind of adventure, as a kind of romantic adventure. Now, what's going on here? King of Spain's Daughter, 1935. Katie Roche, 1936. Irish Constitution, 1937. Irish Constitution, Article 41, Section 2.1. The state recognizes that by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. The state shall therefore endeavor to ensure that mothers shall not be obligated by economic necessity to engage in labor to the neglect of their duties in the home. That's the Irish Constitution from 1937. I suppose it's worth saying that the Irish state has, in recent years, systematically ignored that article of the Constitution. And in fact, the tax regime at the moment actually discriminates against women who choose to work in the home. But for a lot of years, they did take it seriously. That, for instance, women working in the Irish civil service were obliged to give up their jobs if they married, or were obliged to give up their jobs if they had children. So there actually was an attempt to try and enforce this article of the Constitution. You get this sense of women's lives in Ireland in the 1930s as having not a lot of choices. There's a great book in the last year, which you may know, Colm Tóibín's novel Brooklyn. I don't know if any of you have run Brooklyn by Colm Tóibín. Tóibín comes from the same part of the country as Deevy. Deevy's from Waterford, he's from Wexford, from a place called Enniscorthy, not very far apart from one another. Tóibín's the character in Brooklyn is a young woman who basically has a choice of marry a man she doesn't really have much interest in and stay in this small town with very few options, or immigrate to America, immigrate to Brooklyn. And Brooklyn in the novel represents freedom. And that's the choice, in a sense, was to emigrate or to live in a world in which there were very limited options. There's a phrase that was often used in those days in Ireland about getting a place. Getting a place in the bank, getting a place somewhere else, as if there was a single slot that you could find for yourself in life, and that was it. And I think it's one of the things that did lead to so much immigration, over and above economic necessity. And that, in many ways, the great symbol of freedom at that time was here, America. Now, I think this is the context in which in which Teresa Deevy's writing. I think what she's trying to find with her female characters, like Nan Bowers, like Annie Kinsella, like Katie Roche, is an alternative to immigration. She's trying to find, I think, a way in which characters can preserve a certain kind of inner freedom regardless of the circumstances around them. And I think for her, that inner freedom takes the form of what I can best describe as an ideal of love. And I think, when I see the character of Nan Bowers, that I think she starts off, that she has an ideal of love, that James Whelan has to be prepared to give her everything, and she will give him everything. And that's this ideal that I think is there. But the world can't live up to that ideal. So what Nan seems to do is then give up on the world. That the world, she sees the world as a place that will let her down. And so she submits herself to almost any indignity, going to prison, scrubbing the floors. There's an almost masochistic sense about Nan, that she accepts that the world cannot live up to this ideal of love that she's preserving within herself. And that's there in those earlier characters as well. It's there in Annie Kinsella, it's there in Katie Roche. And it's a kind of a curious kind of freedom. But I think, and this is something I've been kind of moving toward thinking about Teresa Deevy, and she is a complex writer. I think there's actually a kind of mysticism, almost a kind of religious mysticism in her work.